Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet desperation of forgotten soldiers, men who faced the kind of cold that didn't just freeze skin, but slowly reached into the mind. Stories once dismissed as simple tales of hardship now reveal a haunting truth that in the dead of winter, even the warmth of fire could mean death. Because when fire was forbidden, survival became something else entirely. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift together into the frozen silence of those long, merciless nights, where men tried to stay alive without warmth, and where even the faintest spark could cost everything. The silence of the frozen front was not like any other silence known to man. It was not peaceful, not soothing, not even empty. It was heavy, a thick, invisible weight that pressed on the skin and filled the lungs with frost. Men could feel it in their bones, that stillness that stretched endlessly across the white wasteland. The kind of quiet where even the sound of a breath seemed too loud, too risky. It was a silence that could betray you. The soldiers had learned that lesson early. Fire meant comfort, but it also meant death. The faintest glow in the dark could be seen for miles, and a single curl of smoke could draw the cold metal thunder of enemy guns. And so they sat in the dark, their hands trembling from more than fear, trying to stay alive in a world where warmth itself was forbidden. At night, the frost would creep over everything: rifles, helmets, boots, leaving a thin film of white that sparkled faintly under the pale light of the moon. It looked almost beautiful, almost gentle, but to the men who watched it form, it felt like the earth itself was sealing them in a frozen grave. They would sometimes brush it away with their sleeves, only for it to return minutes later, like time itself had stopped caring for them. There were no birds, no insects, no sound of life. Only the slow crack of ice expanding, the soft groan of wood, and the quiet breathing of men who tried not to move too much. The air inside the dugouts was thick and stale, and when they exhaled, their breath hung in front of them like a ghost, a reminder that they were still alive. Somehow, some soldiers said the silence played tricks on them. They could swear they heard footsteps in the snow when no one was there, whispers coming from the far end of the trench, or the faint hiss of a fire that didn't exist. Others said the cold itself made sounds, a distant humming, a deep vibration that came from beneath the ground. No one knew what it was. Maybe the frozen soil expanding, maybe their own minds slipping quietly away. There were nights when the men sat together but did not speak. Conversation felt unnecessary, almost wrong. Words carried too easily, and even a cough could echo in that eerie stillness. So they learned to communicate through glances, through gestures, through shared suffering. Sometimes one would hold out a canteen, the gesture slow and silent, and the other would nod that was enough. It's strange to think how quickly the human body adapts. After weeks of living in such conditions, the soldiers could tell the exact temperature just by how their skin tightened when they breathed. They could guess the hour by how deep the frost had settled on the sandbags, and they could feel the presence of snow before it began to fall, a shift in the air, a softer kind of stillness that preceded the quiet descent. Some wrote about it in their diaries, describing how the nights stretched so long that time itself seemed to freeze. One man wrote that he hadn't seen colour in weeks, only shades of white, grey, and the faint black of shadows. Another wrote that he sometimes forgot what warmth felt like, that he could not remember the sensation of holding a mug or of his own skin against sunlight. There was one strange story whispered among them about a soldier who claimed to have heard singing during one of those nights. He said it came from the far end of the trench, soft and low, almost like a lullaby. But when he went to see who it was, there was no one there, only footprints that stopped halfway, as if the singer had vanished into the snow. No one believed him, of course. But still, when the nights grew long, some men thought they heard the same thing, a faint tune carried by the wind, too gentle to be real. The days offered no relief. The cold did not ease with the sun. It simply changed shape. The snow would glare under the pale daylight, so bright it hurt the eyes, and the men would squint, their faces chapped and raw. Their breath would freeze in their scarves, turning the fabric stiff like armor. The smell of damp wool, rust, and human exhaustion filled the trenches. And beneath it all was that constant ache, a deep, gnawing chill that never truly left, even when they wrapped themselves in everything they owned. Sometimes, to distract themselves, the soldiers would imagine warmth. They'd talk quietly about the meals they missed, about fireplaces from childhood homes, about how they'd sit by the hearth when this was over. One man said he used to sleep beside the oven in his mother's kitchen during the winters, and that memory became his only comfort. But the cruelest part of the cold was how it erased even imagination. After a while, it became impossible to recall the true sensation of heat. The mind forgot. When night came again, the darkness seemed deeper than before. The stars looked sharp enough to cut the skin, and the moon, when it appeared, hung low and pale like a watchful eye. The soldiers moved slower, quieter, as if afraid to disturb whatever ancient silence ruled this place. They pulled their coats tighter, checked their weapons, and waited not for battle, but for morning. And yet, despite all of it, life persisted in small ways. A few men kept little rituals. One would whisper a prayer each night. Another would hum softly through chattering teeth. Another would carve tiny shapes into a piece of frozen wood. These small acts were defiance, in their own way, proof that even in a world where fire was forbidden, the human spirit still flickered faintly in the dark. Every so often, a snowflake would drift into the trench, landing gently on a soldier's sleeve. He would watch it melt slowly against the rough fabric, leaving a small dark mark, the closest thing to movement in that still frozen world. And in that single drop of melted ice, he might imagine warmth, or memory, or the faint echo of home. The silence of the frozen front had no mercy, no end. But it also had a strange kind of peace. It was a place where everything unnecessary was stripped away. Sound, warmth, comfort, until all that was left was breath, heartbeat, and will. And in that bare simplicity, some men found a strange clarity. They realized that surviving was not about strength, but about endurance, about learning to exist with the cold, to move with it, to let it become part of you. In the end, the silence did not destroy them. It simply changed them. It made them slower, quieter, older than their years. And when the war was finally over, many of them said that it was not the sound of gunfire they remembered most, but that unbearable stillness, that frozen breath of the world holding itself perfectly still. That was the front where fire was forbidden, where men survived not by fighting the cold, but by becoming part of it, where silence spoke louder than fear, and where warmth existed only as a memory that refused to die. When fire became the enemy, everything that once brought comfort turned into a quiet danger. The men had grown up believing that flame was life, a friend in the cold, a guardian against the dark. But out here, under the endless winter sky, fire betrayed them. It could be seen for miles across the snow. A single flicker, a single thread of smoke curling upward, was enough to give away their position. And so the thing that once meant safety now meant death. There is something deeply human about reaching for warmth. The instinct is ancient. The body remembers fire even when the mind forgets everything else. But the soldiers had to train that instinct out of themselves. They learned to suppress the urge to strike a match, to resist the temptation of light. Some said it was the hardest part of all, harder even than hunger or exhaustion, because the cold was not just physical, it was personal. It crept into every thought, every decision. At night, when the cold pressed down like a living thing, they would huddle in their dugouts, shivering silently. The thought of lighting a candle crossed everyone's mind, but no one dared. Even the glow of a cigarette was too much. They learned to smoke inside their coats, cupping the ember with trembling hands, exhaling into the fabric so no light escaped. Sometimes they joked that they were prisoners of their own breath, but the laughter never lasted long. There was something strange that happened after too many nights without light. The darkness began to feel alive, not menacing, but aware. The men would sometimes stare into it and think they saw movement, faint shapes drifting where there should be none. Some described it as the mind's way of creating warmth, illusions of company when there was none. Others whispered that the darkness was listening, that it remembered every sound they made. The line between fear and imagination blurred quietly in the frost. When fire was forbidden, the cold became an uninvited teacher. The soldiers discovered strange methods to stay alive. They would press together like statues, shoulder to shoulder, forming a silent chain of shared heat. They wrapped newspapers beneath their uniforms, stuffed straw into their boots, and rubbed their hands together until the skin split. Some slept with their rifles close to their chests, not out of duty, but because the metal, though cold, reminded them they still existed in a world that had not forgotten them completely. The few who tried to defy the rule learned the cost. There are records of men who lit small fires deep in the trenches, hidden beneath tarps or boxes. The flames barely warmed them, but the smoke rose anyway, too eager to escape. The result was always the same, a distant shell, a sharp thunder in the distance, and then silence. After that, no one needed reminding. Fire had become the enemy. There was a peculiar moment one soldier wrote about in his pass diary, a memory so strange it haunted him for years. He had been half asleep, his hands numb, when he thought he saw a faint orange light beyond the horizon. For a second, he thought someone had broken the rule, but as he stared, he realized it wasn't fire at all. It was the reflection of the moon on a frozen pond, distorted by the wind. He said that for a few seconds, his body reacted before his mind could catch up. He felt warmth, he felt hope, then it vanished, leaving behind only the cold and the quiet ache of how easily warmth could deceive. They began to dream differently. The mind, starved of heat, filled their sleep with visions of it. Some dreamed of their old kitchens, with crackling hearths and the smell of smoke. Others dreamed of candlelight flickering against a loved one's face. One man said he dreamed every night of lighting a single match, but no matter how many times he struck it, the flame never came. These dreams weren't nightmares, they were gentle, almost tender, a kind of mercy from the mind, offering warmth where none could exist. There were also tales of strange fires that appeared with no explanation. A few soldiers claimed to have seen faint blue lights hovering above the snow, moving slowly and silently across the frozen ground. Some thought it was gas, some said it was spirits, others didn't care to explain it at all. They simply watched in silence, too tired to be afraid, too cold to wonder. The lights drifted and disappeared, leaving behind only questions that no one had the strength to answer. As weeks passed, the men learned to replace warmth with rhythm. They moved carefully, conserving energy, repeating small motions to keep their blood flowing. One man said that he counted his heartbeats to distract himself from the cold. Another hummed under his breath, a sound so low it was more vibration than song. The trench became a kind of strange monastery full of men who no longer sought comfort, only endurance. And yet, in this bleakness, there was something strangely peaceful. Without fire, the night sky looked clearer, the stars seemed sharper, closer, the snow glowed faintly in their light, and the world looked suspended in time. Some soldiers said that in those rare moments, when the wind stopped and everything was still, they felt as though they were the last living beings on Earth. There was no sound of battle, no flame, no life, only breath and stars. It's easy to forget that survival often depends not on what one does, but on what one resists. For these men, resisting fire meant resisting life itself. They had to become part of the cold to think like it, move like it, sleep like it. They became shadows within frost, learning to exist without the very thing that defined human civilization. The irony was not lost on them. Thousands of years after humanity tamed fire, here they were forbidden from using it, punished by the same flame that once gave us dominance over nature. It was as if history had turned backward, returning man to the darkness he once feared. When fire became the enemy, it didn't just take away heat. It took away the rhythm of ordinary life. No crackle of wood, no glow against the walls, no morning smoke rising gently into the air. It left behind a strange quietness, the kind that seeps into the soul and rearranges the way a person understands comfort. And perhaps that's why, years later, when the war ended and they returned home, many soldiers said that they couldn't bear to see the first flame in their fireplaces. It looked too alive, too sudden. Some sat for hours just staring at it, as if trying to remember what it meant. Others said they never truly felt warm again, no matter how close they sat to the fire. Something inside them had stayed behind, frozen in the dark where fire had been forbidden. Even now, when we think of those nights, the silence, the frost, the hidden breath, it's easy to imagine the pain of the cold, but it's harder to understand what it means to live in a world where warmth itself is dangerous. To survive when the thing that could save you is the very thing you must not touch. That was the strange paradox of those winters. The enemy was not just across the battlefield. It lived in the air, in the rules, in the firelight they longed for but could not risk. And in that paradox, in that quiet war between warmth and survival, the soldiers learned something ancient, that life, even stripped of its comforts, still flickers stubbornly in the dark. The cold that never slept was not simply a season, it was a presence. It did not come and go like weather. It lingered, patient and alert, as if it had nowhere else to be. The men learned to live with it, as one might live beside a quiet animal that could not be tamed. It followed them through every hour, pressing against their skin, breathing down their necks, whispering in the stillness. It was strange how the cold could feel awake when everything else slept. Even in the deepest hours of night, when exhaustion dulled the mind, the cold remained alive. It prowled the trenches like something sentient, not cruel, but curious. The men could feel it testing them, seeing who would yield first. Sometimes, one would wake suddenly, his body trembling uncontrollably, convinced that someone had brushed against him, though no one was there, just the air itself, heavy with frost. The soldiers stopped trying to fight it. You can't fight what doesn't move. You can only endure it. They wrapped themselves in whatever they could find, blankets, coats, rags, but the cold always found a way in. Through the seams, through the gaps, through the breath. It was quiet but determined, slipping beneath layers like water, finding cracks in stone. Their world became one of small rituals. Before sleep, if sleep ever came, they would rub their hands together, stamp their feet, breathe into their gloves. Some would share body heat, sitting close enough that they could feel each other's heartbeats through the layers of fabric. There was no shame in it. Out there, warmth was not luxury, it was survival. The cold changed how they moved. It made every motion deliberate, slow, almost reverent. They would pick up their rifles carefully, so as not to break the fragile ice that had formed along the metal. They would blink slowly, because even eyelids grew heavy in the freezing air. Speech itself became effort. Words formed as clouds in front of their lips and vanished before reaching the listener. One soldier wrote that the cold made time strange. Hours no longer felt like hours. The night stretched, elastic and infinite, until dawn seemed like a distant rumour. He said that he sometimes forgot what day it was, what month. All that existed was the slow rhythm of breath, the sound of snow shifting underfoot, and the endless white horizon. The body learned to sleep in fragments, 10 minutes here, 20 there, never long enough to truly rest, never deep enough to dream. When they did dream, it was always the same. Warmth, the memory of sunlight, of kitchens, of blankets heavy with heat. But those dreams came rarely, as if even the mind had grown tired of offering comfort. There was something peculiar about how the cold interacted with memory. It didn't just numb the body, it numbed the past. Some men said they couldn't recall faces anymore, or the voices of their families. The memories were still there, buried beneath frost, but unreachable, like letters sealed in ice. The longer they stayed in the trenches, the more they forgot what warmth felt like, not just physically, but emotionally. One night, a man claimed to see his breath take shape in front of him, not as mist, but as something more. He swore it hung in the air too long, like a faint figure outlined in smoke. He said it looked almost human, leaning slightly toward him before fading back into the dark. He never mentioned it again, but others began to notice similar things. Shapes that lingered, movement in the corner of the eye, a quiet rustle that had no source. They blamed the cold, said it played tricks on the senses, but still, they wondered what it was that moved when everything else was frozen still. The sound of the cold was its own kind of language. It creaked, sighed, and whispered through the cracks of the trench walls. At times, the earth itself groaned as the frost deepened, as if it were alive and restless. The soldiers grew used to it. They began to recognize patterns, the low hum before a frost storm, the faint ticking sound of ice forming on the wire. The landscape spoke in subtle ways, and those who listened could almost predict its moods. There were moments of quiet beauty too. On certain nights, when the moon was high and the air perfectly still, frost crystals would form on every surface, turning the trench into a cathedral of glass. The walls shimmered faintly, and even the mud looked silver. It was beautiful, but fragile, a beauty that could shatter with a single breath. Some men said it was cruel to see something so delicate in a place built for death. Others said it gave them hope, proof that even in misery, something pure could still exist. One of the strangest things was how the cold preserved everything. Food, equipment, even the bodies of the fallen, all frozen in perfect stillness, untouched by time. There were stories of men finding letters tucked in pockets months later, still crisp and unspoiled. In a way, the cold kept everything waiting for warmth, for movement, for life to return. But in that waiting, something unsettling lingered, as if the world itself refused to decay, refused to let go. During the brief hours of daylight, the soldiers tried to stay busy. They repaired trenches, wrote letters, or simply stared at the horizon, watching the light change on the snow. But even then, the cold never released them. It was always there in the numb fingers that struggled to write, in the frost that gathered inside their sleeves, in the quiet ache beneath their ribs. Some days, the air was so cold that it hurt to inhale. The lungs rebelled against it, burning from the inside, yet the men kept breathing, because stopping was not an option. After a while, they began to speak of the cold as if it were alive, not in jest, but with quiet respect. They gave it small names: the Old One, the Watcher, the Silent Guest. It became easier that way, to imagine it as a companion rather than an enemy. One man said it helped him stay sane, to greet the cold each morning, to whisper a small acknowledgement into the air. "Good morning," he would say. "Still here." And somehow that made it bearable. The nights grew longer, but something changed in how the men endured them. They stopped hoping for warmth and instead began to find comfort in endurance itself. To outlast the cold was to prove something invisible not to anyone else, but to the self. It became a quiet contest of will, and in that silence, something ancient stirred the part of humanity that had survived endless winters long before history began. They said the cold that never slept could not be beaten, but in the end, perhaps it didn't need to be. It simply had to be understood, endured, respected. The men who lived through those winters carried its mark forever. Even years later, when they returned to ordinary life, they felt its presence, a chill that never left their bones, a memory that resurfaced in the quiet hours before dawn. And maybe that's what the cold truly wanted, not to destroy, but to be remembered, to remain part of the story. Because in that frozen silence, where even fire dared not live, the cold was the only constant companion, always awake, always watching, always there, the cold that never slept. In the quiet desolation of the front, where fire was forbidden and the frost never truly relented, survival became less of a skill and more of an art, a slow, patient art that existed somewhere between endurance and surrender. The soldiers who lived through those endless winters did not think of survival as a triumph. It was more of a rhythm they had learned to keep, like breathing in cold air and letting it sting, knowing there was no warmth coming to soften it. When the firelight was a death sentence, the men learned to think differently about warmth. They began to find it in things that were never meant to be warm, in the breath of another man sleeping close by, in the faint heat of the earth beneath a collapsed dugout, in the shared air trapped beneath a blanket that smelled of damp wool and smoke long since gone cold. It was a kind of intimacy that was born out of necessity, not comfort. They learned to layer their misery coats over rags, rags over newspapers, newspapers over skin, each layer a small defiance against the unseen enemy that was the cold itself. Some soldiers wrote about the strange sounds the ice made in the trenches. At night, when everything fell still, the frost would creep into the wooden planks and stretch them apart, making soft cracking noises, as if the earth itself was exhaling. One man said it sounded like bones shifting in their sleep. Another said it felt as though the front was alive, not with people, but with the slow, breathing pulse of the cold. No one could tell whether the sound came from the ice, the wind, or something deeper in the ground. To stay alive, they developed rituals, not superstitions. Rituals, because rituals gave rhythm, and rhythm gave reason. They would rub their hands until the skin cracked, then tuck them inside their sleeves to catch the faint warmth of their own pulse. They would count breaths, slowly, like monks in a frozen monastery, to remind themselves that breathing meant living. They would drink water so cold it burned their throats, just to remind themselves that sensation still existed. Some would hum under their breath, not songs, but long, droning notes, almost meditative. It wasn't music, it was survival disguised as sound. And there was another strange thing, the smell of frost. Those who lived long enough began to recognize it. They said the cold had a scent. It smelled like metal, or old coins rubbed between the fingers. It smelled like gun oil and damp stone. But others swore it smelled faintly sweet, like burnt sugar, or the first snow that falls before winter truly begins. It was hard to describe, yet impossible to forget. That scent was the first sign that the cold was about to thicken, the way air thickens before a storm. When warmth could not be made, they began to steal it. They stole it from the ground, from the bodies beside them, from the little moments the cold forgot to press its full weight upon them. A soldier once wrote that he learned to sleep in a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the man beside him. He said if one of them stopped breathing, even for a moment, the other would wake instantly, shivering with panic. In those frozen nights, warmth was not something they possessed. It was something they shared, like borrowed time. The human body, when pressed to its limit, begins to slow itself down. Soldiers noticed it, though they did not understand the science of it. The heart beat softer, slower. The blood thickened. The body learned to save what little heat it had, sacrificing fingers, toes, even memories, to preserve what it could. Some called it the mercy of the cold, others, its cruelty. Because the colder you became, the less you cared about the cold. It numbed not just the flesh, but the will. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous part. There are stories, half forgotten now, of men who would sit perfectly still for hours, staring into the darkness, their breath frozen on their eyelashes. When asked what they were thinking, they would say nothing, just listening to the silence, as if waiting for it to break. Some said the silence was louder than the artillery. Others said it began to speak after a while, not with words, but with memories. You could hear the voice of home, or the crackle of a long-extinguished fire, and if you listened too long, the silence could convince you to close your eyes and rest, just for a moment that might never end. The officers tried to keep the men moving. They ordered shifts, digging, small tasks that gave the illusion of warmth. A moving body survives longer than a still one, but there were nights when even movement froze. The mud hardened to stone, the tools broke in their hands, and the air felt thick, like glass dust. The men stopped speaking, because even breath felt expensive, and yet, in that stillness, they learned things about themselves that only the cold could teach patience. Quiet, the strange companionship of suffering. One curious thing that soldiers often wrote about was how their minds played tricks on them during the coldest nights. Some claimed to hear distant laughter, as if from behind the snow. Others saw lights, tiny, flickering, golden lights that danced just out of reach. They would chase them with their eyes, but the lights always vanished before they could be found. Scientists later called it fatigue-induced hallucination, but the soldiers had another word for it, the fire that walks. A strange, ghostly warmth that wandered the front, seen only by those closest to death. They said if you followed it too long, you would never wake up again. And yet, despite it all, they survived, not through bravery or luck, but through small, quiet acts of defiance. The man who tore his last blanket in half to share it, the one who hummed to himself to stay awake, the one who pressed his hands into the earth, just to remember that something solid still existed beneath the frost. Survival, in those moments, was not a loud victory. It was a whisper, a slow, persistent whisper against the endless cold. Sometimes, when dawn came, the soldiers would find frost patterns on their coats, delicate, crystalline webs that looked almost beautiful in the pale light. For a brief moment, before the orders resumed, they would just stare. The frost had written its own story across them, as if the cold wanted to leave a memory of its touch. And perhaps that's the strangest part, that in a world where warmth was forbidden, beauty still found a way to exist, quietly, like a secret between the living and the frozen earth. There is a certain kind of darkness that doesn't feel like night, but more like the absence of time itself. The soldiers called it the long night, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly, without beginning or end. It wasn't only the absence of sunlight that made it unbearable, but the strange, quiet stillness that wrapped itself around them, pressing close like a second skin. Out there, in the frozen front, the night didn't fall, it simply arrived and refused to leave. The men would lose track of hours. Some said the moon hung in one place for days, refusing to move. Others swore they saw it tremble, as if shivering in the cold sky. The stars offered no comfort, sharp and indifferent. They watched from above while the earth below turned to iron. It was during these long nights that soldiers began to understand what true silence sounded like. Not the kind that comes after noise, but the kind that seems to erase even thought. Every sound was different in the cold. Footsteps didn't echo, they cracked, like glass breaking under pressure. The sound of breath carried too far, as if the air itself was listening. Even whispers had weight. A soldier could tell how close or far another man was just by the rhythm of his shivering. And so, in this strange, frozen world, communication became something else. A language of quiet gestures, shared looks, small motions that replaced words entirely. They learned to sit still for long periods, not because they wanted to, but because movement wasted heat. Some said the nights began to blur their sense of self. They would stare into the darkness until it began to stare back. Shadows took on shape. Some swore they saw movement out in the white void figures walking slowly between the drifts. At first, they thought it was the enemy, but as days passed, they realized these figures never came closer. They simply walked, vanishing and reappearing as if pacing the edge of the world. The men stopped mentioning it in their letters. Some things were easier to keep unspoken. To stay awake, they developed habits. One man would rub the bridge of his nose until the pain kept him conscious. Another would murmur the alphabet over and over, just to feel language move across his tongue. Sleep, they said, was more dangerous than bullets, because in that bitter cold, sleep felt warm. It was an illusion, a soft trick of the mind. Many who closed their eyes never opened them again. The officers began to call it the quiet death. The soldiers gave it another name, the gentle one, and they feared it, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. When a man began to drift, the others would shake him, slap his face, curse softly, not in anger, but in pleading. Sometimes they would drag him upright, make him walk in circles. It was their way of keeping him tethered to life. You could always tell when someone was losing the fight. Their eyes became distant, almost peaceful. Their words slowed, turning to murmurs. Some even smiled. That was the worst sign. A man smiling in the cold meant he had made his peace with the night. The frozen front became a kind of shared dream. The men forgot the world beyond it. They forgot the feeling of summer air, or what rain sounded like when it wasn't mixed with snow. They began to imagine warmth as something mythical, not just heat, but a kind of golden light that existed somewhere beyond memory. They spoke of it the way children speak of fairy tales. A few carried small pieces of home, a matchbox, a photograph, a torn bit of scarf, and held them close, as if the memory itself might give off a little warmth. There was a peculiar phenomenon that some soldiers wrote about in their diaries. During the longest, coldest nights, a faint glow would appear on the horizon. Not the light of fire that was forbidden, but a soft, bluish shimmer, like frost reflecting a hidden moon. They called it the sleeping light. It was never bright enough to illuminate, but it seemed to pulse, faintly, in time with the silence. Some men thought it was the reflection of distant artillery. Others believed it was something older, the earth itself, breathing beneath the ice. A few swore it whispered, though no one could ever describe what it said. As hours dissolved into one another, time lost its edges. Some nights, a man would swear he'd seen dawn begin to rise, only for the horizon to fade back into darkness again. The mind began to drift without anchor. The soldiers spoke less, moved less, even thought less. And yet, within that stillness, a strange calm sometimes emerged. It wasn't peace, exactly more like resignation or acceptance, as though the cold, in its relentless presence, had taught them something about simplicity. The body wanted warmth, the soul wanted quiet, and here, at least, quiet was plentiful. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when the world seemed almost beautiful. The frost on the barbed wire glittered like spun glass. The moonlight turned the trenches into rivers of silver. The breath of men hung in the air like ghosts, hundreds of tiny clouds rising, fading, rising again. For a brief instant, the line between life and death, warmth and cold, seemed thinner than ever, and then the moment would pass, swallowed again by the vast frozen dark. No one really spoke of the nights after they ended. Perhaps they feared that remembering would make them real again. The long nights became a kind of myth, something that lived only in the eyes of those who had endured them. Even when the war was over and fires were lit freely again, many found themselves unable to sleep in warm rooms. They said it felt wrong, as if the air was too soft, too forgiving. Some left their windows open in winter just to let the cold in. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was the ghost of that endless night refusing to let go. The strangest thing of all was how the human mind can grow, attached to its own suffering. Those who lived through the frozen nights often described missing something about them, not the pain, not the fear, but the simplicity. In those hours, stripped of everything, life became small and pure. Every breath mattered, every movement had purpose, every heartbeat was proof of existence. In the long nights that never ended, survival became its own form of prayer, quiet, repetitive, unspoken, but deeply human. And even now, if you walk across those old battlefields on a winter evening, you can still feel something in the air. The wind carries a certain stillness, not emptiness, but memory, as though the frost remembers the men who once whispered through its silence, who fought against sleep, against cold, against time itself. And if you listen closely, in the hush between the gusts, you might almost hear it, the faint sound of breath, steady and slow, echoing from a night that never truly ended. In the frozen silence of those endless winters, companionship took on a shape unlike anything before or after. It wasn't built on laughter, or friendship, or even conversation. It was built on proximity, on the quiet understanding that another human presence, breathing beside you in the dark, could mean the difference between life and death. The soldiers didn't call it brotherhood. They didn't even call it friendship. It was something simpler, quieter, the frozen companionship, born out of necessity and bound by the cold. In the trenches, warmth was a shared resource. Two men would huddle together under a single blanket, their shoulders pressed so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. They could feel each other's breath, the rise and fall of chests struggling against the cold air. Sometimes they didn't even know each other's names, but that didn't matter. In the frozen front, names were less important than body heat. You could die knowing a man's heartbeat, but not his story. At first, the closeness was awkward. Soldiers had come from different cities, different classes, different worlds entirely, but the cold was a master equalizer. It stripped away pride, rank, and distance. It reduced men to the simplest form of life, warmth-seeking creatures clinging to one another beneath a sky of ice. And slowly, that closeness became habit. A strange intimacy emerged, quiet, wordless, almost sacred. One soldier wrote in his diary that the man he slept beside during that winter was closer to him than any brother he had ever known. He said, "We never spoke much. We didn't need to. The silence between us was enough." The cold had a way of forcing men into honesty. In the dark, when their teeth chattered and their fingers stiffened, the masks fell away. They would speak of home, not with longing, but with resignation, the smell of bread baking, the sound of a dog barking, the feel of a blanket that was truly warm. Some would whisper prayers they barely remembered from childhood. Others would tell small lies, claiming they weren't cold or that they didn't miss anyone. But the others could tell. The breath of a lie is different, thinner, shakier. In the frozen dark, Even lies froze before they reached the air. Sometimes they would talk to those who weren't there. A soldier would wake suddenly, half frozen, and turn to his side to speak to a companion who had died days before. It wasn't madness, at least. Not the kind doctors understood. It was habit. When you share so many nights breathing the same air, silence feels unnatural, so they spoke to ghosts, softly, as if the dead were still listening, and perhaps they were. Some claimed to feel a lingering warmth beside them, long after a body had been carried away, just enough to make them doubt enough to wonder if the bond between the living and the frozen was truly ever broken. The soldiers developed small, unspoken rituals to maintain the illusion of connection. They would check one another's hands for frostbite before sleeping. They would place their canteens beside each other to keep the water from freezing. In the mornings, they'd share what little food they had, even if it meant going hungry themselves. Not because they were generous, but because the act of sharing reminded them that humanity still existed somewhere beneath the frost. The smallest gesture, a piece of bread, a muttered joke, a hand placed briefly on a shoulder, could feel like warmth itself. The strangest thing was how quiet the companionship became over time. They no longer needed to fill the silence. The cold itself became a language. The sound of teeth chattering, the scrape of boots against ice, the slow, careful exhale, these were conversations in their own right. When someone stopped making noise, even for a few moments, others would notice instantly. Silence, once comforting, could become terrifying. It meant something had gone wrong. It meant someone had slipped away. There were stories, passed quietly between the men, of soldiers who refused to leave their fallen companions. Even when ordered to retreat, they would sit beside the frozen bodies, whispering, as if keeping them company one last time. Some believed the soul lingered until dawn, and that no man should be alone in the dark. Others simply couldn't bear to break the companionship, even when it had turned to stillness. There is something haunting about that. The thought of a man sitting quietly beside a friend who no longer breathes, both surrounded by the same unending cold, both illuminated by the same indifferent stars. At times, that companionship extended beyond the living. In the stillness of the trenches, soldiers sometimes felt as though the dead were still present, not as spirits, but as part of the place itself. The cold seemed to carry them. The frost on the walls looked like fingerprints. The wind through the cracks sounded like faint breathing. It gave the impression that no one was ever truly alone. The frozen earth was full of memory of footsteps, whispers, and the warmth that once was. In a strange, quiet way, the front became a kind of grave that also served as a home. Some men began to name the frost. They spoke to it like an old companion. It crept into everything, their boots, their blankets, their thoughts, until it was impossible to tell where it ended and they began. They called it by gentle names, almost affectionate ones. Old White, the sleeper, silent friend. They hated it, but they also depended on it. The frost was the one constant presence, the one thing that never abandoned them. In a world where fire was forbidden, the cold became both enemy and companion. There was one peculiar thing that soldiers often mentioned in their letters: the sound of breathing at night. In groups, when they huddled close together to sleep, their breaths would synchronize over time, dozens of men inhaling and exhaling as one. The sound, soft and rhythmic, was almost like the sea. It lulled them into sleep, reminding them that even in the coldest moments, life persisted quietly, stubbornly, together. One soldier described it as a single body with many hearts. That line, written in the margins of a frost-stained page, captures something deeply human, the shared endurance of men who could not have survived alone. As dawn approached, the companionship would shift again. The light revealed faces lined with frost, eyes hollow but alive. They would nod to one another, not in greeting, but acknowledgement. Another night survived, another breath shared, And then, without ceremony, they would resume their quiet tasks, their routine gestures. There were no speeches, no thanks, no words at all. Just the unspoken understanding that survival had been a collective act. Years later, those who lived would say they never experienced closeness like that again. Not in peacetime, not in marriage, not in friendship. The frozen companionship belonged to that winter alone. It was forged not from joy or trust, but from the mutual recognition of fragility. Two souls pressed together in the dark, keeping each other alive by mere proximity. It was, in its own way, a form of love stripped bare of sentiment, silent and enduring. And perhaps that is what makes it so haunting. Because in the end, the frost did not only claim lives, it connected them. In the coldest, most isolated corners of the earth, men found a warmth that could not come from fire. They found it in one another, in shared breath, in quiet patience, in the soft rhythm of life continuing against the odds. It wasn't the kind of warmth that comforted, it was the kind that reminded them they were still human. And sometimes that was enough. The cold changed everything, even the way food tasted. In those endless winters, meals were not meals at all. They were rituals of endurance, small encounters with survival. The soldiers called it rations, but the word felt too generous. What they ate was something between memory and necessity. A few scraps of bread, a sliver of meat, a tin that smelled faintly of iron and smoke. And always, that same aftertaste lingered, metal, cold, and the faint sweetness of rust. They used to say you could taste the war in everything. The spoons were metal, the cups were metal. Even the steam that rose from their breath carried a metallic note. Water stored overnight in canteens would freeze solid by morning, forming a dull grey block that had to be thawed with body heat. The men would cradle the canteens between their knees or under their arms until a few drops of liquid formed, and those drops, when they touched the tongue, tasted like the trench walls themselves. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just strange, the flavour of earth and metal, of time slowed down. The bread, when it came, was stone hard. They would tap it on the edge of the table, and it would ring softly, like wood. Some tried to soften it with breath or warm it near a candle flame, but that often made it worse. It released a sour, burnt smell, something that reminded them of home yet felt distant. The butter, if they had it, was pale and brittle, cracking like frost on glass. Meat tins, when opened, exhaled a scent both comforting and stale. There was no distinction between good and bad food anymore. Everything was reduced to fuel, a small offering to the body, meant only to keep the hands from shaking and the eyes from closing. Eating became an act of patience. The men chewed slowly, not out of pleasure, but because their jaws ached from the cold. The metal spoons stuck to their lips if they moved too fast, and once someone's tongue froze briefly to the rim of his cup. After that, everyone learned to eat quietly, slowly, as though the food itself might break if touched too quickly. The sound of metal against metal became the rhythm of their existence. Spoon against tin, knife against ration, cup against teeth. In that stillness, it was one of the few noises that reminded them they were still alive. Sometimes, when the snow fell hard and no new supplies arrived, they would invent flavors in their heads. They'd take a bite of cold bread and imagine it was warm, soft, soaked in broth. They would close their eyes and pretend the dull grey water was tea. A soldier once wrote that he dreamed of the sound of boiling, just the sound, not the taste. The gentle bubbling of water in a pot seemed, to him, the very definition of peace. In a world where even warmth was a rumour, imagination became its own kind of nourishment. The cold had a strange way of preserving food that wasn't meant to last. Meat frozen solid could stay edible for weeks, though it became so hard it had to be cut with a hammer. The men joked that the food would outlive them, and perhaps it would. They learned to bite through ice-coated tins, to drink water that still held shards of frost. There was no separation between what was frozen and what was food. Both were part of the same landscape. The line between life and cold grew thinner with every meal. One peculiar story passed through the camps about a group of men who discovered that their tin rations gave off a faint metallic hum when struck. They began to treat the tins like instruments, tapping them softly at night, producing small, dull notes that echoed through the frozen dark. It wasn't music exactly, but something gentler, the sound of men reminding themselves that the world could still respond to touch. They called it the Song of the Tins. The officers dismissed it as nonsense, but the men swore that on some nights the hum seemed to linger in the air, like a ghostly vibration, as if the cold itself was humming back. Another strange thing, the taste of blood. Many soldiers noticed that their mouths tasted faintly metallic all the time, even when they weren't bleeding. Some said it came from the cold air, others from rust carried on the wind. One man wrote that it felt as if his tongue had become a small piece of metal, part of the trench, part of the weapon he carried. Over time, they stopped noticing it. The taste became normal, even comforting. It was the taste of life continuing in unnatural conditions. Iron in the mouth, frost in the lungs, silence all around. There were moments of quiet intimacy even in this bleakness. When someone found a scrap of sugar, it was passed around like treasure. The men would let it melt slowly on their tongues, eyes closed, remembering for a brief second the sweetness of normal life. The sugar never lasted long, but its memory did. One soldier described it as a light too small to see but too warm to forget. In that tiny act of sharing, they rediscovered something human, the capacity for gentleness, even when surrounded by cold metal and hunger. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the men would sit with their empty tins, scraping the insides just to hear the sound. It became a kind of meditation, the quiet rhythm of survival. The scraping noise echoed softly in the frozen stillness, and they would listen as if the sound carried meaning. Perhaps it did. When all other comforts are gone, even a faint metallic sound can become a companion. It reminded them that effort, no matter how small, still existed. That life, somehow, continued. One curious observation emerged among those who survived. Years later, long after the war, they could still taste that metallic note whenever the air turned cold. Even decades later, during winters in peaceful cities, they'd sip from a cup and find that same ghostly flavor on their tongues. The faint, unmistakable memory of frozen tin and breath against metal. They didn't speak of it much, but it was there. A quiet reminder that some sensations never fully leave. The frozen rations were not just food, they were a reflection of the environment itself, lifeless, durable, and indifferent. Every bite carried the cold inside it. Every swallow was a small act of defiance. And yet, in that slow endurance, there was beauty. The act of eating, even when flavorless, was a gesture of persistence. It said, "I am still here." The metal can may rust, the bread may freeze, but I remain. In one letter home, a soldier wrote, "We eat the same as the earth slowly, without taste, but enough to live." It's a strange sentence, but perhaps the most truthful. The men had become part of the landscape, silent, enduring, made of frost and iron. Their meals were no longer moments of comfort, but small reminders of survival's quiet dignity. By the end of that endless winter, they had grown used to the taste of metal. It was no longer strange, but familiar, like the sound of wind or the feel of their own breath. It belonged to them as much as the cold did, and in a way, it united them. They all shared that same taste, that same faint reminder of what it meant to live through something that wanted them gone. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of it all, the way the simplest acts, eating, breathing, surviving, became echoes of the same truth, that even in the most lifeless cold, life adapts. It finds a way to persist, quietly, stubbornly, without flavor, without warmth, just the steady rhythm of existence. The frozen rations were never just food. They were symbols of endurance, of the human body's ability to carry on when nothing else would. And when the men closed their eyes at night, the taste of metal still lingered on their tongues, a reminder that they had endured another day, another night, another breath. Sleep was rare in the frozen front, and when it came, it arrived like a thin whisper rather than rest. The men didn't so much fall asleep as drift between wakefulness and something quieter, a state where the mind continued walking long after the body had stopped. And in those fragile hours, when the night pressed in from all sides, dreams began to take on a strange, vivid shape. They weren't the dreams of comfort or escape, but of warmth, the kind of warmth that seemed almost mythical in that world of frost and steel. Some soldiers spoke of fire, but not the dangerous kind that drew enemy shells. In their dreams, the flames were small and patient candlelight on a wooden table, a hearth flickering in a cottage far away, or the orange glow of a pipe ember held between gentle fingers. The dreams were soft and impossibly detailed. A soldier could wake and still remember the smell of the smoke, the warmth brushing his face, even the quiet crackle of the wood. For a moment, he would feel the ghost of heat still lingering, only to vanish as he opened his eyes to a world of frozen breath and colourless dawn. There was something strange about these dreams. They seemed to pass from man to man, as though shared. One soldier would wake and describe the exact same vision another had experienced the night before, a room filled with dim light, the sound of snow melting, the faint scent of bread warming near a fire. It became almost a superstition, a secret belief that warmth itself was trying to reach them, crossing through sleep, reminding them of something they had nearly forgotten. They called it the collective dream. No one claimed to understand it, but in the morning, the men would sometimes smile faintly to one another, as if they had all visited the same quiet place. Dreams of warmth were not always comforting, though. Some carried a melancholy weight, as if warmth had become a memory of loss. In one account, a soldier wrote that he dreamed of holding his mother's hand beside a fire, only to realize as he reached for her that the fire was inside her, and the glow came from her fading away. He woke with his hands trembling, his fingers still clutching the cold air. It wasn't fear that stayed with him, but the unbearable tenderness of something that could no longer exist. The human mind, it seems, has its own ways of creating survival. When the body cannot find warmth, the mind invents it. Studies done long after the wars suggested that the brain, when exposed to extreme cold for long periods, can generate hallucinations of heat, flickers of light, sensations of burning skin, even the illusion of sunlight. Perhaps those dreams were the body's last attempt to comfort itself, the mind trying to convince the body that help was near. But in those long nights, science had no place. The soldiers didn't question it. They simply accepted the dreams as gifts, however brief. There were nights when the line between dream and waking blurred. Some men spoke to the air as if it were alive. Others smiled in their sleep, murmuring softly, hands twitching as though warming them by an invisible flame. And when the frost grew too heavy, a kind of gentle confusion set in the mind slowed. Thoughts drifted. A soldier could be half awake, half lost in the dream of warmth, unable to tell which was real. In some cases, those who drifted too deeply never woke again. They were found with faint smiles, their faces serene, as though they had finally reached that long-sought fire. It's a haunting thought, but perhaps a kind one, that the last moments of some lives were not cold at all, but filled with the imagined comfort of warmth. The men who survived sometimes said that those who died in the cold went peacefully, dreaming of home. No one really knew what that meant, but they repeated it anyway. It was easier to believe that death in such a place was gentle, that the mind had the power to soften even that. One peculiar pattern noticed by medics was that many soldiers described the same recurring image before hypothermia, set in a door opening into a room filled with orange light. No one could explain it, and yet, across years and continents, the image appeared again and again in diaries and letters. The warmth was always beyond the threshold, just out of reach. Some claimed they felt it just once, as they closed their eyes. Whether it was a dream or something else, something older, deeper, no one could say. There is an old idea that warmth isn't just physical, but spiritual. In ancient traditions, warmth was thought to be the presence of life itself, a sign of the soul's quiet fire. When that fire dimmed, people didn't say you were dying, they said you were cooling. Perhaps, in those frozen fields, surrounded by endless snow and silence, the men weren't only fighting for their bodies, but for the small flame inside that defined their humanity. The dreams, then, were not escape, they were reminders of that inner heat, flickering but never extinguished. One veteran later described how, even after the war, he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, sweating, with the sensation of warmth spreading through him. He said it always came with the faint sound of snow falling. "It's strange," he wrote, "but I think the cold taught me what warmth really is. Not heat, not fire, just the feeling of being safe for a moment, even when you aren't." His words lingered long after, like a soft echo of that endless winter. In the darkest hours, when sleep refused to come, the men would whisper about what warmth meant to them. One said it was the sound of his wife's voice. Another said it was the colour of morning tea. Another, with a distant look, said warmth was simply anything that made time move faster. These quiet exchanges, though small, carried more life than any fire could. They were fragments of humanity flickering in the cold words shared like embers, passed carefully between those still awake. Perhaps the most haunting thing about these dreams of warmth is that they still survive, in a way, not in the minds of the men, but in the stories they left behind. When you read their letters or hear their words, there's an echo, a faint trace of heat in the language itself. The ink may have frozen as it dried, the paper may have yellowed with time, but the warmth hidden in those words remains untouched. It's as if, through the act of remembering, we keep that dream alive. The cold was endless, but so were the dreams. Even when everything froze, imagination remained liquid. It seeped through the cracks, through thought and breath and memory. The men didn't just dream of fire, they dreamed of touch, of comfort, of being human again. The cold took everything, but not that. And perhaps that is why they endured, because even when the body fails, the mind still remembers warmth, the feeling of it, the promise of it, glowing somewhere just beyond reach. So when they finally slept, with frost on their lashes and silence in their lungs, they dreamed not of victory or homecoming, but of something far simpler, warmth. And in those dreams, for a brief, merciful moment, the war was quiet, the air was gentle, and the world, at least in their minds, was no longer cold. It happened quietly, almost as if the world had been holding its breath for too long and finally decided to exhale. The snow stopped falling. The wind, once relentless, faded into a distant murmur. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, the soldiers could hear something else. The fragile sound of stillness, no longer frozen but alive. They didn't realize it at first. Silence had become so natural, so woven into their existence, that its absence felt strange. When it broke, it was like waking from a long, cold dream. Morning came pale and colourless. The horizon, once hidden beneath endless clouds, began to reveal faint shades of silver and blue. There was no music, no celebration, no great moment of recognition. Just breath visible, rising softly into the air, merging with the mist. The men stirred slowly, as though afraid to disturb the peace. Some blinked at the light, uncertain if it was real. Others stayed still, their eyes half closed, as if they were afraid that moving might cause the quiet to vanish again. It's strange how sound can carry differently after silence. The crack of distant ice felt louder, the drip of melting frost sounded like rain. Even the faint creak of boots in the snow seemed sacred. One soldier later wrote that it felt as though the world itself had been asleep, and they were the first to wake it. But awakening didn't bring joy, only a kind of deep, trembling relief. The war was not over, the cold was not gone, but the spell had broken. Something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the air. For days, the men had been listening not for commands or footsteps, but for the faintest trace of sound. The silence had weight, a pressure that made thoughts echo too loudly. Now, with the first signs of thaw, even the smallest noises seemed alive. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, and every head turned. It wasn't the sound itself that mattered, but what it meant, that something had survived. Life, fragile and uninvited, had found its way back into the frozen front. And yet, with that return came an unease. The silence had been terrible, but it had also been familiar, a kind of companion. It had its own rhythm, its own comfort. The soldiers had learned to live inside it, to think within its quiet folds. Now, with the return of sound, the world felt unpredictable again. The cracking of thawing wood, the whisper of shifting ice, each new noise was both wonder and warning. Some men covered their ears, as though overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of life. They said that on the morning the silence broke, the air carried a smell they hadn't noticed before, a mix of damp earth, rusted metal, and something faintly sweet, like thawing pine sap. The cold had locked every scent away for so long that its return felt almost unnatural. One soldier described it as the smell of memory itself. He said it reminded him of a forgotten time before the war, though he couldn't name what it was. It lingered in the trenches for hours, then disappeared, leaving only the faint trace of warmth behind. With the thaw came small, ordinary miracles. Ice on helmets began to melt, forming droplets that caught the light like tiny prisms. The men watched them fall, one by one, landing in the mud below. It was such a simple thing, water moving again, yet it felt like a message. The earth was stirring, the cold had not won completely. Life, patient and slow, had been waiting just beneath the surface all along, but not everything returned gently. When the frost began to release its grip, it gave back what it had taken. Letters buried in snow resurfaced, their ink blurred but still legible. Bits of cloth, rusted tools, and sometimes the remains of those who had been lost in the deep freeze. The thaw revealed everything, the living and the dead alike. There was no cruelty in it, just inevitability. Nature, it seemed, was quietly reclaiming its own balance. One strange thing the men noticed was how sound began to travel differently as the cold lifted. Voices no longer carried so far. The air, once sharp and metallic, became soft, almost heavy. They could no longer hear each other from the next trench. The silence had been vast and connecting. The thaw felt intimate and close. It made conversations quieter, slower, as if the men feared breaking something fragile. Even laughter, rare as it was, came out muted, half swallowed by the mist. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, something almost gentle. The men began to speak again, at first in whispers, then with more ease. They shared small things, a memory of a meal, a story from childhood, a description of a summer afternoon long gone. These weren't grand confessions or heroic tales. They were simple fragments, the kind of human warmth that words can carry when fire cannot. The silence had been vast, but it had also isolated them. Now, speech returned like the first signs of spring, fragile, hesitant, but alive. As the thaw continued, they began to hear the world again, the wind moving through broken fences, the slow trickle of meltwater, the faint hum of insects that had survived beneath the ice. Each sound was a reminder that time, which had felt frozen for so long, was flowing once more. The war would continue, yes, but the stillness that had once swallowed everything would not return in quite the same way. The men, though weary, felt a small flicker of gratitude, not joy, but acknowledgement that even in a place built for death, life had found its quiet rhythm again. Years later, those who survived would speak of that day with a strange reverence. They said it was the moment they learned to listen differently, not just with their ears, but with something deeper. The world had taught them silence, and then, gently, it had taught them sound again. They carried both lessons for the rest of their lives. Even in peace, some said they could never sleep in noisy places. They missed the silence not for its comfort, but for its clarity. Some claimed that the silence never truly ended, that if you closed your eyes and listened carefully enough, you could still hear it. A faint, distant hum beneath all sound, like the memory of cold preserved in the air itself. They said it lived inside them, somewhere behind the heartbeat, waiting, not haunting, just watching, as if silence itself was something sacred, something too easily forgotten in the noise of ordinary life. And perhaps that's the quiet truth of it all. The cold, the hunger, the stillness, they were not only battles of the body, but of the spirit. The soldiers learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about finding meaning in moments when everything else was gone. When the silence broke, it didn't vanish, it simply changed shape. It became the space between words, the pause between breaths, the calm after memory. It followed them home, soft and invisible, like frost that never quite melts. So now, as we close this long night together, perhaps it's worth remembering that kind of silence, the kind that teaches rather than frightens, the kind that asks nothing but patience, the kind that exists just before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath waiting for light. And maybe, in that same quiet, you can feel what those soldiers once did, the strange, sacred peace that comes when the noise finally fades, and the cold releases its hold, just enough to let the world begin again. Good night.